When you need a lawyer, how do you find the right one? Contact the Chicago Bar Association.
Whether you've been injured or need a will prepared, whether you're buying a home or starting a business, having the right lawyer is essential. The Chicago Bar Association have lawyers who practice in most areas of law and speak a variety of languages.
Don't leave it to chance. Get a referral to a screened, experienced lawyer. Visit chicagobar.org or call 312-554-2001. The Chicago Bar Association. Se habla español.
Welcome to You and the Law, a Chicago Bar Association production that provides information on various legal and policy matters of public interest. I'm Mike Alkaraki, a partner at Leahy, Hoste, Alkaraki, where I represent plaintiffs in cases of personal injury, medical negligence, products liability, and wrongful death. I'm also an adjunct professor at Loyola and UIC Law here in the city, and a member of the Chicago Bar Association, where I've served on the board of managers. On this installment, I'm very thrilled, really, to welcome back true experts and real meaningful leaders on First Amendment constitutional issues and beyond. Attorneys, scholars, advocates David Goldberger, Thomas Ginsberg, and Geoffrey Stone. They are joining us to explore First Amendment issues related to Israel-Palestine. And I am, of course, welcoming them all back because we've done two previous shows that they have been so generous with their time to participate in. And I thank them all for being here on this very important and somewhat, it's been proven to be a difficult issue, I think, for public discourse. So it's good to have brains like this and people with experience to come in and discuss it in detail. So rather than giving a great deal of background on each of our guests here, I'm going to turn it to them to highlight some things that they may think are relevant in terms of their background. And I'd like to start here with Professor Stone. If you can share a little bit of your background, we'd appreciate that.
So I'm the Edward H. Leahy Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, former dean of the Law School, provost of the university, and free speech has been my primary focus during the 50 years of my academic career.
Great. Thank you very much for being with us. And Professor Ginsberg, if you can give us
Yes, I'm Tom Ginsberg. I teach also at the University of Chicago Law School, and my work is on constitutional democracy all over the world, where it comes from, what threats there are to it, and how it can survive, also how it ends. And most relevantly for this, I'm now running something at the University of Chicago called a Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression, trying to deepen campus commitments at our university and others to free expression and to dialogue across difference. I should say I'm also a affiliate with the American Bar Foundation here in Chicago.
Great, thank you very much. And we're going to turn now to Professor Goldberger. And Professor, I'm going to ask you, after you provide a little bit of an intro, to talk a little bit about, as a jumping off point, I think it's an appropriate one, the Skokie case, which many people may know well. But if you can provide some background and then perhaps parlay that into the Skokie case in brief.
Sure. I am the professor emeritus at the Ohio State University College of Law. Prior to that, I was legal director of the Illinois ACLU. My primary focus really, by chance as it started, but in fact it became the focus, was the First Amendment. And I've represented a range of groups, at one point the Communist Party, the Nazi Party in Illinois, and just about everything in between. Now, the Skokie case, just briefly, was a case in which a band of neo-Nazis wanted to hold a public assembly in front of the village hall in Skokie, which, as many viewers probably know, is a community which at the time had 40 to 50% Jewish residents and a very significant number of Holocaust survivors. And the controversy was whether or not the First Amendment protected the right of the Nazis to hold a peaceable assembly. I was then legal director of the ACLU, and I provided counsel to the Nazis.
And I think it's probably fair to, first of all, obviously the tensions built in that are so obvious, right? So there's a lot to unpack there. But I'll start by saying, before I get to some questions, that representation and your role there has, in many ways, been over the years become viewed as one of the most profound expressions of faith in the First Amendment, and that's part of, I think, what's important to get into, the real heart of it. So perhaps we can start with the First Amendment generally in terms of underlying principles, limitations. And perhaps, more broadly, why, and we don't have to answer this all at once, this is more thematic, but why it's important for democracy, for good social conditions, even on an individual basis, even for individual thought. Maybe Professor Ginsberg, if you want to take a crack at that to get things started.
Yes, well, thinking about it from an international human rights perspective, free expression is sometimes thought of as the most important right, because without the ability to express yourself, to complain, to criticize government, etc., no other rights really are viable. So it is kind of a linchpin right from that perspective. And from my perspective, it's also definitional of democracy. Democracy obviously is about more than just having elections. You really do need the ability to criticize, the ability to raise awareness of issues, the ability to debate. And so from my perspective, it really is core to constitutional democracy.
Thank you. Professor Stone, if you could follow on that a little bit.
Well, one of the things that's important for people to understand is that from a First Amendment standpoint, the Supreme Court did not give much weight to freedom of speech or of the press in the first 50 years in which it was deciding these cases. It upheld the convictions of individuals during World War I who criticized the draft and the war. It upheld the convictions of the leaders of the Communist Party. And it basically took a relatively passive view about freedom of speech. Today, we kind of take it for granted that this is a fundamental constitutional right in our nation. But it's important to know that the justices learned from their own mistakes. And over time, they came to recognize that prior decisions had been wrong and bad for the country, and that they allowed, to a much greater extent than appropriate, those in control, those in power, to silence their critics. And this was dangerous to democracy. It undermined the fundamental principles of democracy. And if you could imagine our society today, if government had done that over the last 50 years, we would not have had, for example, gay rights. We would not have had women's rights if the government could have suppressed that speech. So it's very important to understand that this is not an inherent and natural state of affairs. It's something that we learned over an extended period of time. And we're now in a relatively good place in terms of the First Amendment doctrine, although how that applies to universities right now is very complicated.
Sure. Let's before we get specifically into Israel-Palestine, let's have just a brief note on the general exceptions and limitations to the principle of free speech, and whoever would like to jump in to take that one, feel free.
That's
the Supreme Court has taken the view from the beginning there are certain categories of speech that are not entitled to the full protection of the First Amendment. And from the beginning, the court said that included things like obscenity and threats and false statements of fact and commercial advertising, because those had not been understood as protected by free speech over the course of time before the Supreme Court began interpreting the First Amendment. On the other hand, in all of those categories, the court over time has given much more protection to speech that fits within those categories than it did in the beginning. Again, because it recognized that even those categories of speech have value. It's also important to understand that the court has rejected the proposition that incitement to violence is low-value speech and can be prohibited unless it produces a clear and present danger of grave harm. And similarly with hate speech, the court has, without a single exception, all justices have taken the view that hate speech is not low-value speech, and therefore has to be given the same degree of protection as any other speech under the First Amendment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And perhaps I'd like to dig into sort of the hate speech concept perhaps a little later. But before we do that, I'd like to now get into speech issues specifically related to Israel-Palestine. And as a threshold question, are we seeing efforts, initiatives, or even campaigns to suppress speech and assembly in the United States related to Israel and Palestine?
I wonder if I might start with that. Though I've
Sure.
been thinking about the fall as it unfolded is sort of happening in three phases. So, you had basically the first phase was October 8th or a few days thereafter, where there was a lot of genuinely offensive speech without question in terms of, anti-Israel speech, I guess you'd say. These victims deserved it, the righteous cause of, murder and rape. Then there was a reaction to that, which was, to my mind, unprecedented. We saw people getting fired. We saw people getting dropped from their, talent agencies. We saw law students losing offers. And that was its own, massive, phase and quite controversial. From my point of view, the third phase started with that hearing of the university presidents on December 5th. And now we're in a phase which has nothing to do with Israel and Palestine and nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It's about politicians bringing university campuses into front and center in the culture wars. And I think that's, probably going to be with us for several months, very difficult terrain to navigate. But particularly in that middle phase, there's two things going on. No one has a right to a job at a law firm. And if you say something that your employer doesn't like, you can be fired. We're in an at-will country. But at the same time, there's a perception that, I think that obviously this has been more used against the pro-Palestinian voices than the pro-Israel voices. And I guess I'd just say from the point of view of a university campus, from my perspective, most campuses have actually done a bad job on both. That is, no one really feels that able to speak. And that's really a problem given the core mission of what we're trying to accomplish in universities.
Of course. And, the issues of academic freedom, which I know are near and dear to, all your hearts. And even as an adjunct, it's near and dear to my heart. I mean, those are important issues. I know. Well, we'll get into that, I suppose, incidentally, or however you'd like to. And we can, I'd like to hear, a take from Professor Stone and then Professor Goldberger on that threshold question of whether we are seeing those efforts, how you see those or experience those, conceptualize them.
I'm sorry, we are seeing what?
Efforts to suppress speech related to Israel-Palestine.
Oh, well, absolutely we are. And that's highly problematic. And the effort to suppress is coming from many different quarters. In the university context, I think it's very important that universities understand the importance of educating their faculty and students about the importance of free expression and academic freedom and the right of individuals to express views that may offend others. And that's simply a major part of who universities are and what they're about. And that also, I think that it's important that law firms and donors should recognize that putting pressure on universities to engage in the suppression of speech that they don't like is undermining the fundamental values of a university. And that's a serious problem. It's not the first time it's happened in our history, but it's a serious problem today. So I do think that the University of Chicago actually has the best record and the best history in terms of dealing with these sorts of questions. And between the Calvin Report and the Chicago Principles, the university has recognized both the fact that universities should not themselves take positions on public issues unless they are directly relevant to the functioning of the university, because that suppresses speech and deters speech, and that it's important for universities to protect the freedom of speech of students and others, and not to turn over that power to the people who oppose it. And I think that one of the reasons why the hearings were so difficult is those universities had not followed those principles. And therefore, they found it difficult to take the positions they now wanted to take. But I do think this is a great moment for universities to rethink their positions and, frankly, in my view, to move towards the Chicago approach.
Mm-hmm. I've actually read, and I know it's not just coming from one mind, but it's a culture in the Chicago approach. But I know that the Professor Ginsberg, I don't know if I've listened to a lecture or read something, probably both, about how universities can really protect themselves and protect their mission by taking such an approach. And it's something clearly that the universities, even at the highest levels, are struggling with profoundly. Okay, Professor Goldberger, if you can address that threshold question, I mean, what's your impression?
I don't have much to add to what's already been said by my colleagues, but the thing that is, I think, implicit in both of their comments, but I really want to highlight, is the fact that this is performative politics that we're looking at. This is not, these are politicians and donors and students, frankly, who are trying to score political points and who are not really interested in the dialogue, as far as they're concerned, to the extent that they can control the dialogue by various means. Their goals have been satisfied, and that is a major step back from where we were, for example, even during the Vietnam War, when there was a heavy debate going on.
Sure. And that might attach, and we don't want to necessarily get off topic, but sort of the more broad sort of political theater that's become a substitute for actual policy, it seems like, in general terms. Okay, so I'd like to turn briefly to one example, which had, and this was, well, I suppose they're related. There's both, Florida had a gubernatorial order, I believe, to decharter or defund Jewish Voice for Peace, as well as Students for Justice in Palestine. We've seen, so that was in Florida. We've also seen Columbia University suspend Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voice for Peace. That's obviously campus related, and there's a lot going on there. I did notice also in doing some research that I did find. Tell me, you can certainly tell me if I'm wrong or there are counterexamples. I'm looking for them, but it's appeared to me. My impression is that speech suppression efforts tend to be disproportionately directed towards pro-Palestinian rather than pro-Israel speech. Is that reasonably accurate, or how might we characterize that if we're going to be as fair as possible?
Maybe I could jump in here.
Sure.
So obviously campuses, even private universities must, in our view, have as broad a possible space for free speech, even if the First Amendment doesn't directly apply, because of course we're training citizens, who are going to live in a democracy. And, thus we should have the widest possible space for discussion. Now, of course, there are limits on that on campus. You can't disrupt someone else's speech. You can't occupy a building. You can't tear down posters of hostage victims and such. So we have to distinguish between sort of good faith speech, even protest-related speech, even performative speech, as David put it, and conduct. And in our experience here at the University of Chicago, we have had a couple incidents where generally the pro-Palestinian group will break the rules. This happened at our law school a few years ago, where they completely disrupted a pro-Israel speaker. And then, of course, we're punished. That's just, you need those rules in order to facilitate the environment. Now, I bring this up because I think there might be different stories in Columbia and Florida. And from my reading of the Columbia stuff, the JVP and the SJP were banned for violating the policies. Whereas in Florida, it seems to be targeted at the nature of their speech. Now, let me just say something about Columbia, which was run by Jeff's very close friend, Lee Bollinger, but they rate very poorly on rankings of free expression on campus. And one reason is that in order to have an event on campus, you had to give 10 days warning in advance. And that's the rule that the SJP and the JVP violated, and thus were, disbanded for violating that rule. Now, that's not a very speech facilitative rule. If you have a crisis that erupts in the world, sometimes demonstrations need to be immediate, and I can't see any reason for that kind of rule. And
Sure.
so you might look at their breaking of that rule as kind of the old question in law about when do unjust laws need to be broken. So I think the story, when you unpack it, isn't just about suppression of speech, but it is about campuses not doing their job of providing an environment in which we can talk across this issue.
Sure. Thank you very much. We could go so much deeper into that, but I want to keep moving to touch on some other things. I'd like to bring up the House Resolution 894, which has a number of aspects to it, but the one I'd like to focus on is the equating of Zionism with anti-Semitism in the resolution, and just open that up for some commentary from you, from whoever else.
And I think you mean anti-Zionism with
Excuse me,
anti-Semitism.
I apologize. My big mistake. Thank you so much. House Resolution 894, equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Anyone want to take that?
Well,
You want that?
my own view is that it's been it's such a sensitive area, but it strikes me that it has been a way to shut down, in my view, the expression of ideas, particularly animus toward Israel and animus toward Israeli policies vis-a-vis Palestinians. And I think that there are people who believe to their very core that they equate, because if you destroy Israel, for example, or if you're opposed to the existence of Israel, which is what anti-Zionism is, then you're opposed to Jews. But I think that logically, if you take the words apart, I just don't think that's an equation that holds up. It's unfortunately become, nonetheless, very difficult to persuade people to look at it carefully and thoughtfully.
Sure, I appreciate that. I'll kind of dig into that a little bit. I don't believe that Zionism is defined even by reference in the resolution, and I'm not exactly sure what the operative definition is. The import of that being, it appears to me that there are one can have anti-Zionist positions and still, for example, support a two-state solution or the existence of Israel, but object to some of the practical application of what appears to be flowing from what I think, correct me if I'm wrong, may be properly characterized as a political ideology.
Yeah, from my point of view, some of the criticism of Israel obviously is not anti-Semitic, and some of it is. And so what's the line? Obviously, we have to have a debate about that. And that's why we need broad parameters for free speech. There's actually some resources available if anyone's interested. There's something called the Jerusalem Declaration, which was put out by a bunch of academics, which sort of tries to draw a line as to what criticism is anti-Semitic, what is not. The International Holocaust Remembrance Association has a definition of anti-Semitism, which essentially does equate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. I think that's too broad, even if it has been adopted by a number of organizations, because it just squelches speech.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left, and I've got a big question, of course, at the very end. So we'll try to have a concise response, hopefully, like just on an individual level. Why is free speech important just for individual thought? And one I could bring up without getting into too much detail. There was an NPR piece within the last month that I forgot. I should know the institution. I forgot the school, but there was a poll of hundreds or near 1,000 professors with expertise on Israel and Palestine and that region, who sounds like the poll, I think, was 80% of those polled felt like these are professors, felt like they were self-censoring when it came to criticism of Israel, whereas some smaller percentage of like around 10 or under percent felt like they had that pressure when it came to criticizing Palestinian criticism. And that's just one angle on it. But in short, in a couple sentences, maybe each of you can chime in with a thought or ethic on individual thought and free speech.
Well, the primary focus of the Supreme Court in interpreting the First Amendment and free speech has been democracy. That is, the importance of the ability of individuals to express their views to others, to convince them to adopt certain policies and elect certain officials and so on. But the court has also long recognized that another critical aspect of it is individual autonomy. That is part of what it means to be a respected human, is the ability to express one's own views. And whether it's in the political context or otherwise, if you were told you can't say what you want to say because it's offensive to others or problematic for others, then you would feel very much as if you were constrained in terms of your freedom and in terms of your individual humanity. And the court has recognized that as an important element of free speech. And that seems to be perfectly correct.
Right. Thank you very much. A couple closing thoughts from Professor Ginsberg and Goldberger, and we'll wrap.
You first, David.
Well, the only thing I would add, and again, just to what Jeff has just said, is that it really, the notion of freedom of speech really focuses on mistrust of government, that government cannot be trusted to decide what's good and what's bad. And the examples, particularly in the areas of censorship arising out of anti-Semitism, is the jailing of Holocaust deniers in Europe, and the firing of and jailing of Holocaust deniers in Canada, and for anti-Semitic statements. And these are ones without threats. I mean, these are just statements that are advocacy of a particular viewpoint. And that's troubling, because then the government really starts to take over and control the dialogue.
Sure. Thank you.
There's a long line of sort of political theory and philosophy saying that it's not just about government and talking about politics. It really is about our human need to express ourselves. And there's something very valuable. We actually think through conversation, if you think about it. We don't come up with ideas on our own through lightning bolts. We talk with other people, we sharpen our ideas. And so it is really what makes us human. So I think it is really important. In terms of the statistic you mentioned about the Middle East Studies Association, I mean, let's not assume that all academic associations are, populated equally by advocates on one side or the other. I mean, they're self-selecting. And this is one of the things when we get into academic freedom, which we haven't talked too much about today. It depends, its critical linchpin and perhaps Achilles heel is that it depends on disciplines. What's in and what's out. And those disciplines can go wrong. I just do want to say that academia is not perfect, but we do need academia because of all the major problems in the world today. You're not going to be able to get there without serious research. And that's one of the reasons we're focusing on this issue in the Chicago Forum on Free Inquiry and Expression.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And with that, we'll conclude our program. Thank you all for participating, and thank you for participating multiple times. And thank you for your scholarship, your integrity, and frankly, your courage, because I think this is not easy stuff for everybody to talk about. It's important to have leadership, and you've provided it here. And thank you also for our viewers for tuning into this installment of You and the Law.